Well, good afternoon, everyone, or good evening, or good morning, wherever you may be. It is 5:30 on the dot, and I think we will go ahead and begin our activities for tonight. I want to welcome all of you to the Free Enterprise Forum, which is sponsored by Baylor University's Baugh Center for Entrepreneurship and Free Enterprise. My name is Peter Klein. I'm chair of the Department of Entrepreneurship and Corporate Innovation here at Baylor, and I'm also the academic director of our Free Enterprise program. And I'm really excited tonight to welcome our special guest, Glenn Loury. Let me tell you a little bit about our program. The Free Enterprise Forum is a distinguished lecture series bringing prominent academics, journalists, policymakers, other public figures to Baylor to speak to faculty, staff, students on important issues of the day, with a particular emphasis on those related to the nature and implications of the free enterprise system and its role in fostering entrepreneurship, economic growth, and improvements in societal well-being. In the current environment, as I'm sure you can understand, we have moved some of our events to a virtual format, like tonight's Free Enterprise Forum, but we're also meeting face-to-face where we can. Besides the Free Enterprise Forum, this lecture series that you're joining us for tonight, we have a number of other programs as well. We sponsor research, student activities, and community outreach related to entrepreneurship and free enterprise. Our next Free Enterprise Forum will be November 4th at 5:30 p.m. That will be in person on campus here at Baylor, featuring British author Matt Ridley, who will be talking about his new book called How Innovation Works. Our next meeting in our Confessions of an Entrepreneur series, which hosts entrepreneurs here in the Waco area to talk to students about their experiences, will feature Corey Dickman, who is the founder of Waco escape rooms. If you've never done an escape room, I can highly recommend it. They are a lot of fun. That is going to be October the 27th in Foster 143 and 144 at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And all of these events are free and open to the public, so we welcome participation from those in the community, besides those of you who are here at Baylor. Okay, so tonight it is my great pleasure to welcome Glenn Loury for a discussion of an obviously extremely important and interesting topic called Capitalism and Race. And I should mention that tonight's talk is co-sponsored by the Department of Economics here at Baylor. Professor Loury is the Merton P. Stoltz Professor of Social Sciences at Brown University, where he's been on the faculty since 2005. He was previously at Boston University, where he was university professor and founder and director of the Institute on Race and Social Division. He also taught at Harvard, where, if I have this correct, he became in 1982 the first tenured African-American professor at Harvard. He was also on the faculty at Northwestern and at Michigan. Professor Loury received his PhD in economics from MIT. He's published widely on a variety of topics in applied microeconomic theory, game theory, industrial organization, natural resource economics, and of course, the subject of tonight's talk, the Economics of Race and Inequality. Professor Loury is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, which, as you may know, has only a small number of economists among its membership. So that's really an extremely important honor. He's also a fellow of the Econometric Society. He's been the vice president of the American Economic Association. He's been a recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship and has many other accolades and honors, which of course you can read about on his website. Loury, aside from being a very prominent academic, is also an important social critic and public intellectual, writing mainly on themes related to racial inequality and social policy. He's published over 200 essays and reviews in journals of public affairs in the US and abroad. He's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. He's a contributing editor at the Boston Review and was for many years a contributing editor at the New Republic. He has a number of important books that are accessible to the general reader, including One by One, From the Inside Out, Essays and Reviews on Race and Responsibility in America, published by the Free Press in 1995 and the winner of several book awards. He published The Anatomy of Racial Inequality with Harvard University Press in 2002. He published Ethnicity, Social Mobility, and Public Policy, comparing the US and the UK with Cambridge University Press in 2005. And more recently, Race, Incarceration, and American Values, published by MIT Press in 2008. So it's quite obvious from his credentials and from his record of public engagement that he is one of the world's leading experts on the economic and social aspects of race. And he's going to talk to us tonight on recent developments in race relations, including the concept of anti-racism, the shift of emphasis within organizations and institutions from diversity to concepts like equity and inclusion, and also the role of markets in addressing racial bias. Now, we're doing this as a Zoom webinar, so those of you who are watching the lecture, you won't be able to ask questions directly, but you can type questions as they occur to you in the Q&A box on Zoom. So you should see a little Q&A button. You click on that, little box will pop up. If you'll ask your questions in the Q&A box, then I will, at the conclusion of the talk, I will read as many of those as possible out to Professor Loury and let him give his comments and reactions. So thanks to all of you for being here, and please join me in welcoming Glenn Loury to Baylor. Glenn, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you very much. Very generous introduction. I'm grateful for it. I'm very happy to be speaking to Baylor people and to your institute. I just want to correct one thing in your intro. I was not the first African-American tenured professor in the history of Harvard University. I was the first to receive tenure in the economics department. There were others who preceded me in the university. But I want to share my remarks with you, which I've prepared for this occasion, so just bear with me. I've given the title here, Thoughts on the Persistence of Racial Inequality in America. I want to begin with a provocative claim. Structural racism, about which we hear so much these days, is an empty category. The phrase is used as both a bluff and a bludgeon. It's a bluff in that it explains nothing while, in effect, daring the listener to notice. For example, when someone says structural racism is the reason why there are so many Blacks in prison, the listener is being dared to reply, no, it's actually because there are so many Black criminals. And it's a bludgeon because its use involves rhetorical intimidation. Having demonstrated no cause and effect processes, it insinuates shadowy causes that are never fully specified. Everybody's just supposed to know that racial disparities are the fault of something called structural racism, abetted by an environment of white privilege, supported by the ultimate bugaboo, white supremacy. George Orwell, the author of the classic 1984, would have seen this way of talking as a version of his newspeak, the use of ambiguous and euphemistic language as a kind of political propaganda. History, I must say, is rather more complicated and more interesting than such just so tales would have it. The outcomes of concern here have multiple interacting causes, but people declaring that structural racism explains racial disparities don't make arguments. Rather, they evince a disposition. They are calling us to solidarity. They're soliciting our fealty. They seek to compel our affirmation of a system of belief. So in this lecture, I'm going to sketch an alternative account of enduring racial disparities. Now, I warn you, I am an economic theorist first and foremost, so my focus here will be conceptual, not empirical. I think we economists need to specify the appropriate model for understanding long enduring racial economic disparities. And so I aim to contribute to that objective in the remarks that follow. As you will see, I do not mince words. Now, why, I want to ask, the success of the civil rights movement notwithstanding, has the unequal economic status of Black Americans persisted into the 21st century? Clear thinking about this difficult problem requires that we distinguish between the role played by anti-Black discrimination, past and present, and the role of behavioral patterns to be found among some Black people. Now, I admit that this puts a very sensitive issue rather starkly. I will be charting a middle course by acknowledging anti-Black biases and insisting they be remedied, but also urging that we also identify the behavioral patterns that prevent some people from seizing newly opened opportunities. In recent writings, I have recast these two positions as causal narratives. The bias narrative argues that the root cause of persisting disparity is found in anti-Black racism. Racial discrimination causes racial inequality, so we have to reform society to achieve a level playing field. It focuses on the demand side of the labor market, for instance. I think such reforms have been necessary, but I think they are not sufficient. The development narrative, by contrast, is concerned with how people acquire skills, traits, habits, and orientations that foster their successful participation in society. Its focus is the supply side of the labor market. Its premise is that those who lack the experiences, who are not exposed to the influences, who do not have access to the resources that foster and facilitate their human development will, in general, fail to achieve their full potential. Of course, these two narratives, the bias narrative and the development narrative, need not be mutually exclusive, but what is clear is that they point in different directions in terms of intervention and remedy. I'm going to be advocating for thinking about this problem through the lens of the development narrative. This tension between a focus on demand side versus supply side factors to account for racial disparities is a very old theme for me. It is what led me to coin the term social capital in my doctoral dissertation back at MIT in the 1970s. In doing so, I was contrasting that concept, social capital, with the more familiar notion to economists, human capital. As you may know, human capital theory studies inequality via a conceptual framework that was initially developed to explain investment decisions by firms, and that focuses on formal economic transactions. I thought that this framework was not adequate when applied to explaining persistent racial economic disparities. I believe my concerns then remain relevant today. And so I'll use my time here to explore these ideas more fully. My basic point in that thesis was that associating business with human investments is merely an analogy, not an identity, particularly when thinking about persistent racial disparities. Business investments are transactional. Human investments are essentially relational. So important things were overlooked in the human capital approach, things having to do with informal social relations. Conventional theory, I thought, was incomplete when accounting for racial disparities, and there were two aspects of this incompleteness, which led me to make two observations. One about the dynamics of human development, and the other about the nature of racial identity. I wish to reiterate these observations because they remain relevant today. First, about the dynamics of human development. My first observation was that all human development is socially situated and mediated. The development of human beings occurs inside of social institutions. It is dialogic. It takes place as between people by way of human interaction. The family, the community, the school, the peer group. It is inside these cultural institutions of human association where development is achieved. Resources essential to human development, the attention that a parent gives to her child, for instance, are not alienable. Developmental resources, for the most part, are not commodities. The development of human beings is not up for sale. Rather, networks of connections between people create the context within which developmental resources come to be allocated to individual persons. Opportunity travels along the synapses of these social networks. People are not machines. Their productivity, that is, the behavioral and cognitive capacities that bear on their social and economic functioning, are not merely the result of some mechanical infusion of material resources. Rather, these capacities come about largely as the byproducts of social interaction mediated by human affiliation and connectivity. This point was fundamentally important, I thought, and still think, for understanding persistent racial disparities in America. That was the first point I was making all those years ago about the incompleteness of human capital theory. But my second observation is also important. My second observation was that what we call race in America is mainly a social and only indirectly a biological phenomenon. The persistence across generations of racial differentiation between large groups of people in an open society where people live in close proximity to one another provides irrefutable indirect evidence of a profound separation between the racially defined networks of social affiliation in that society. Because there would be no races in the steady state of any dynamical social system unless on a daily basis and in regard to their most intimate affairs, people paid close attention to the boundaries separating themselves from racially distinct others. This is so because over time, race would simply cease to exist unless people were acting so as biologically to reproduce the variety of phenotypic expression that constitutes the substance of racial distinction. I cannot overemphasize this second sociological point. We speak casually about racial equality and racial justice, and yet race is not something simply given in nature. Rather, it is socially produced. It is something we are making. That there exist distinct races and is an equilibrium outcome. It's endogenous. It follows that if the goal is to understand the roots of durable racial inequality in any society, we should examine in some detail the processes that cause race to persist as a fact in that society. Almost certainly, such processes will not be unrelated to the allocation among individuals of human developmental resources. So here is my second observation in a nutshell. We economists need to recognize the limits of our tools to account for durable economic disparities by race. The creation and reproduction of such inequality ultimately rest on cultural conceptions that people hold about identity, about the desirability and legitimacy of conducting intimate relations with racially distinct others. And here, I do not only mean sexual relations. Racial inequality is not just a disparity of material resources. Most fundamentally, it is rooted in the decisions that we are all making about with whom to associate and with whom to identify. Such, anyway, was the gist of my argument. The contrast that I drew in my doctoral thesis all those years ago between human and social capital was grounded in my conviction that such decisions determine the access that people enjoy to the informal resources they require to develop their human potential. And so what I was calling social capital when I coined that term in 1976 is, on this view, an essential prerequisite for creating what economists refer to as human capital. As economists, we know that human capital, a person's skills, education, work experience, and social aptitudes, is a key determinant of that person's earnings power and of his or her capacity to generate and to accumulate wealth. Social capital is, in my mind, an extension of human capital theory. The resources people need for their development are not all commodities, as I've said, that can be acquired in markets as a result of transactions. Some of those resources are embedded in a person's social situation. For example, the resource of a mother's attention to her health when a child is in her womb, the resource of peers with whom one associates, and the things they valorize, which then become important things shaping the choices one makes about the acquisition of skills. The resource of information about what is possible to achieve that comes about from one's connection to others who have explored those possibilities. These things are also factors of the production of human skill, or inputs, if you will, into that process of production. But these things are not commodities, as I have said. So a financial deficit does not fully capture a deficit of these things. This was the idea I wanted to employ to give an account of durable racial inequality, even after eliminating most overt market discrimination. I wrote that dissertation in the mid-1970s, just a decade beyond the big civil rights laws, and quite early in this era of relatively fair market opportunities for people, irrespective of race, the era in which we live now. This post-civil rights era is more than a half century old now. I'm not saying that things are perfect in terms of racial equality of treatment, but they are very, very close to being perfect, especially when compared to the historical circumstance. Obviously, there's work to do, but it is a relatively level playing field now in terms of the valuation of skills. So the question before us is whether the disparities that history has produced for Black people will necessarily wither away under this new dispensation. My answer is no, they needn't, because the labor market, the credit market, the housing market, and the final goods markets are not the whole show. Also important are peers, neighborhoods and communities, the structure of families, the nature of values and norms, notions of identity, social resources, who you're connected to, who you can call upon, who influences you, who informs you. These things matter. Books in the home, whether the children are read to, when does a parent turn off the television set? My social capital concept is a tool for thinking about inequality and its remedies. It disciplines our thinking so as to appreciate the limits of regulatory control when developmental outcomes are the byproducts of non-market processes. It shifts the conversation somewhat away from a purely redistributive focus to a relational focus. I am not saying that people without money have no need of it. What I'm saying is that money is not the only thing they need. Capitalist laissez-faire may sometimes be an enemy, but the death of God is never our friend. Talking in this way is not blaming the victim. It's having one's eyes wide open to the reality of our social life. Oppressed groups time and again evolve notions of identity that cut against the mainstream. A culture can develop among them, inhibiting youngsters from taking the actions needed to develop their talent. Now I ask, do kids in a segregated dysfunctional peer group simply have the wrong utility functions? I think it's a mistake to attribute the dysfunctional behavior of an historically oppressed group of people to simply them having the wrong preferences when those preferences have emerged from a set of historical experiences that reflect the larger society's social structures and activities. But, and this is critical, by the same token, it's a grievous error to ignore the consequences of such behavior or to pretend that the behavior doesn't exist, as many anti-racism advocates are doing. I want now to shift to a slightly different point. By ignoring those behavioral maladies characteristic of some quarters of African-American society, those who downplay behavioral disparities by race are bluffing. Behavioral issues afflicting Black communities are real and must be faced squarely if one is to grasp why racial disparities persist. Self-evidently, the young men who are killing each other on the mean streets of St. Louis, Baltimore, and Chicago, and many other places are behaving abominably. Those bearing the cost of such behavior are mainly Black people. As I have said, an ideology ascribing that behavior to racism ultimately is a bluff. It can't be taken seriously by serious people. Nobody believes it, not really. Consider, for another example, educational test score data. Anti-racism advocates are in effect daring you to say that some groups are represented at elite universities in outsized numbers compared to other groups because their academic preparation is simply magnitudes higher and finer and better. This kind of excellence is an achievement. One is not born knowing these things. One acquires such knowledge through effort. Why some youngsters have acquired these skills while others have not is a deep and interesting question, one which I'm quite prepared to entertain, but the simple retort, racism, is laughable, as if such disparities have nothing to do with behavior, with cultural patterns, with what communities and peer groups value, with how people are spending their time, with what they identify as being critical to their own self-respect. Asian Americans are said sardonically to be a model minority. Well, as a matter of fact, a pretty compelling case can be made that culture is critical to their success. Don't just take my word for it. Read Jennifer Lee and Min Zhou's book, The Asian American Achievement Paradox. They interviewed Asian families in Southern California trying to learn how these kids get into Dartmouth and Columbia and Cornell at such high rates. What they find is that these families do in fact exhibit cultural patterns, embrace values, adopt practices, engage in behaviors, and follow disciplines that orient them so as to facilitate the achievements of their children. It defies common sense as well as the evidence to assert that they do not, or conversely, to assert that the paucity of African Americans performing at the very top of the intellectual spectrum. I'm talking here about excellence and about the relative low number of Blacks who exhibit it. Has nothing to do with the behavior of Black people. That this outcome is due entirely to institutional forces. That, frankly, is an absurdity. Nobody really believes it. Neither does anyone believe that 70% of African-American babies being born to a woman without a husband is, one, a good thing. Nobody really thinks it's okay. Or two, is due to anti-Black racism. They say it, but they don't really believe it. They're bluffing. They're daring you to observe that 21st century failures of African Americans to take full advantage of the opportunities that have been created by the 20th century's revolution of civil rights are palpable and damning. And yet these failures are being denied at every turn. This is not a tenable position. The end of Jim Crow segregation and the advent of equal rights for Black people was a game changer. That now, a half century down the line from this, we still face these disparities is shameful. The plain fact is that much of the responsibility for this sorry state of affairs lies with the behaviors of Black people ourselves. I take no pleasure in saying this. I'm simply trying to stay in touch with reality. But the anti-racism crusaders refuse to acknowledge that reality. I would add that there is an assumption in all of this rhetoric about anti-racism of Black fragility, or at least of the lack of resilience among Black people. This assumption lurks behind these anti-racism arguments. Blacks are often treated like infants whom one dares not to touch. One dares not to say the wrong word in front of us, dares not to say the things that I've already said in this lecture. to ask any questions that might offend us, to demand anything from us for fear that we will be so adversely impacted by that. The presumption is that Black people lack resilience, cannot be dealt with like adults, and are disagreed with, criticized, called to account, asked for anything. No one will ask Black people, for example, what do you owe America? How about not just what does America owe us, reparations for slavery, et cetera, what do we owe America? How about our duty? How about honoring our country? When you take agency away from people, you remove the possibility of holding them to account and the capacity to maintain judgment and standards so that you can evaluate what they do. If a youngster who happens to be Black has no choice about whether or not to join a gang, pick up a gun, or become a criminal because, quote, society, close quote, has failed him by not providing adequate housing, healthcare, income support, job opportunities, et cetera, then it becomes impossible to discriminate as between those Black youngsters who do and do not pick up guns and become members of gangs under those conditions. It becomes impossible to maintain within African American society a judgment of our fellows' behavior. It becomes impossible to affirm expectations of right living because, after all, we're all supposedly victims of anti-Black racism. We're leveled down by a common lack of agency in this way of looking at the world, a presumed lack of control over our lives, a lack of accountability for what we do. This is not a path to equality. What is more, there's a deep irony in first declaring white America to be systemically and essentially racist, and then mounting a campaign to demand that whites recognize their own racism and deliver us from the consequences of it. If indeed you're right that your oppressors are racist, why would you expect them to respond to a moral appeal? You are, in effect, putting yourself on the mercy of the court while simultaneously decrying that the court is biased. Much of the anti-racism arguments that I've seen people make that have become very widely accepted, I could name names, but you know who they are of this sort. There's no possibility. Don't believe in the American dream. Don't drink the Kool-Aid. Don't buy the narrative. America's a gangster republic. America's an intrinsically racist society. It'll never recognize our humanity. This kind of idea is profoundly empowering, and it's also a false characterization of this dynamic and vital and free and open society. I am reminded amidst the contemporary turmoil of the period after emancipation more than 150 years ago. There was a brief moment of pro-Freedmen sentiment during Reconstruction in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, but it was washed away. And the long, dark night of Jim Crow emerged. Blacks were set back. But in the wake of this setback emerged the development of some of the greatest achievements of African American history. Thus, the freedmen, who had been liberated from slavery in 1863, were almost universally illiterate. Within a half century, their increased literacy rate rivals anything that has been seen in the modern world in terms of a mass population acquiring the capacity to read. Now, that was a really significant achievement because it helped bring them into the modern world. We now look at the Black family lamenting the high rates of births to mothers who are not married and so forth, but that is a modern post-1960 phenomenon. In fact, the health of the African-American social fiber coming out of slavery was remarkable. Books have been written about this. Moreover, businesses were built. People acquired land. They educated their children. They acquired skills. They constantly faced opposition at every step along the way. No Blacks need apply, whites only this and that and the other. And nevertheless, they built a foundation from which could be launched a civil rights movement in the middle of the 20th century that would change the politics of the country forever. That potentiality is now forgotten as we throw ourselves, like I said, on the mercy of the court. There's nothing we can do. We're prostrate here. Our kids are not doing well. Our communities are troubled, but here we are, and we ask that you save us. This is the very same population about which such a noble history can be told. So, pull yourselves up by the bootstrap. That's a kind of cliche, and people will laugh when you say it. They'll roll their eyes. Take responsibility for your life. No one's coming to save you. It's not anybody else's job to raise your children. It's not anyone else's job to pick up the trash from in front of your home, et cetera, et cetera. You want wealth? Start a business. Take responsibility for your life. That, frankly, is a message that we need to hear more and more today in the Black community. Perhaps the messenger should be a Black person as well. I expect if you want the message to be heard, that would be helpful. But that, I think, is the reality of our condition. We must take responsibility for our fate. We must take responsibility for our children. This is not fair in light of history's mistreatment of Black people in this country. But this is another delusion. People think that there's some power up in the sky that's going to make sure everything works out fairly. Cosmic justice is what Thomas Sowell calls it. They don't realize that life is full of tragedy and atrocity and barbarity. It's not fair. It's not fair, but it's the way things are. It's not fair, but it's the way of the world. Here's what I finally have to say to my co-racialist here in the year 2021. If you want to walk with dignity, if you want to be truly equal, recognize that white people cannot give Black people equality. Black people have to earn equal status. Please don't get angry with me because I'm on the side of Black people here. Still, I must insist that equality of dignity, of standing and respect, of security in your position in society, of the ability to command the respect of others, these are not things that can be handed over. These are things that must be wrested with one's bare hands from a cruel and indifferent world. We have to make ourselves equal. No one can do it for us. Thank you.
Wow, thank you very much for those provocative, stimulating remarks. I just want to remind members of the audience that you can click the little Q&A button and you can type in a question. I'm sure there are things that you heard that that you liked and made you think, but if you're like most college students, faculty, and other members of the community, there are probably a few things that you haven't heard before or that you're not used to hearing on a college campus, and you might have some reactions or might want some clarification. I guess I'll take the privilege of sort of starting things off with a question or two myself. One, just by way of background, this was implicit in Glenn in your remarks, but I'd like to bring it out a little bit more fully. You referred to the arguments that a very influential economists such as Gary Becker and Thomas Sowell, Walter Williams, others made about how market competition can play a role in, if not eliminating completely, at least reducing racial discrimination. And the argument was simply that employers or other market participants, lenders, et cetera, pay a price for engaging a preference or a taste for preferring people on dealing with people on a basis other than merit, and therefore competition among employers, lenders, whatever it might be, will tend over time to sort of squeeze out or at least severely discipline the extent to which racial preference can be accommodated on the market. Now that argument goes back, to the 1960s. It certainly wasn't always universally accepted among the general public, but it seems to me that most economists thought that analysis of discrimination was basically correct, even though they might have some quibbles on the margin. It appears that today, in 2021, and maybe for the last 5 years, 10 years, even among economists, that argument seems to have fallen out of favor. I don't know whether it's a suspicion that competition doesn't really work in general, that it's more there are market frictions, or maybe it has to do with institutional racism. I don't really know. But could you comment a little bit on how economists thinking about discrimination on the market seems to have changed quite a bit in recent years?
Yeah, I can. That's that arbitrage argument. You can't sustain discriminatory outcomes in the face of competition if the discrimination is based on the indulgence of an employer's preference, because there will exist some margin somewhere of employers or potential employers who don't have the anti-Black preference. They will see the opportunity of effective profit that could be made by employing the workers that the racist employer doesn't want to employ, or employing them at wages above what the racist employer is willing to pay them. And they'll gain market share. This is Gary Becker, the Economics of Discrimination. I think that book is like 1955 or 1956. Now, I think there's a lot of evidence supporting that observation. Becker made something of this in his original work, and others have followed on. The implication is that where you see persisting racial disparities in wages, controlling for the productivity of the workers, you run a regression. You try to explain the variation of wages in a population. You control for their human capital. And you see that a coefficient on a race dummy variable is a negative coefficient. They're getting less on average. You would expect that to be more prominent in places where there are barriers to entry in the industry in question, where there are limitations in the capital market, so that this arbitrage operation can't get itself going. And I think Becker, in the original work, pointed to that, and others have shown that that is also the case. Also, and I think Walter Williams was the one who was prominent in making this point, but historically, and Thomas Sowell's historical examples are many. There are many historical examples in which racist employers have basically used the power of government to restrict the entry of competition. South Africa, for example, had to employ explicit law against hiring Black people in industrial positions that they wanted not to see Black people occupy, because otherwise the firms would have gone ahead and violated the social restraint on integration in their workforces in pursuit of profit. Now, you asked me, has this argument lost favor amongst economists, and why? Well, some economists, yeah. And I think some of the studies, the famous resume studies where you send out, and you get solicitations of employment that are biased against Blacks based on comparable resumes, things of that kind, audit studies. But I would just call the interested students' attention to the work of James Heckman, who I think has been very effective in casting doubt on the extent to which you could make an inference about market outcomes from the observations that researchers are drawing about resume study bias and things that, or even tester bias. These are not measuring the marginal action in the market. They're measuring the average. You could look at Heckman's piece, for example, in the Journal of Economic Literature, Journal of Economic Perspectives, 1998. It's been a while, but so on. Anyway, I don't know why everybody is lining up to affirm this deep insight from economics, but maybe I could flip the question on you, Peter, and ask you, why are economists not unanimous in seeing that the minimum wage is a very poor way of trying to raise the income of workers?
That's a good question. A lot of the things that I was taught in my graduate training that I thought were universally or nearly universally recognized, apparently that no longer holds. But Yeah, that's a great answer. Let me move on to a few questions from some of our students. There's some professors asking questions too, but let me get to the student questions first before the professors ask some more, some trickier ones. So one question from a student is, I know that in your talk, you've sort of diagnosed what you see as the problem and outlined in a very general way what might be the path forward. But when you're talking about something like social capital, which emerges and changes very slowly, are there specific strategies that you would recommend for persuading people to engage in different modes of development, or to try to embrace or change the social capital that's available to them? In other words, what are some practical steps that would help to bring about reductions in racial inequality, given the theoretical framework that you've outlined, besides writing books and articles and giving speeches and so forth?
Yeah, well, you're not going to like my answer. I don't know is my answer, and I don't need to know in order to diagnose the problem correctly, which is what I'm trying to do. I mean, we could begin to have a conversation about that. It's going to be contentious. I could say that you should try to design the incentives built into social policy so as to encourage marriage and intact families, and then we're going to have an argument. I could say that government is not the answer to everything. Actually, that's true. That's true. Government policy is not the only game in town. This is a conversation that's going on amongst people in communities where there are choices to be made about how they live their lives, how they, organize themselves, and so on. We could talk about the culture, not just policy, but what's on television. What is Hollywood doing? What's the narrative? What are the messages that are being sent out to people? We could talk about education. How are children being raised and educated and so on through our institutions of public education in order to think about what they can do in their lives? I noticed that your center focuses on entrepreneurship. I think that's a good thing. I think some of the answer to the disparity is to be found in the entrepreneurial and inventive behaviors of people in various communities. What about charter schools? Those are opportunities for entrepreneurship in a certain way, not just for making money, but for making a better society by finding ways of effectively delivering educational services to people who need it. And it's an anathema to half of the political spectrum. Charter schools are the bad thing because the teachers union opposed the competitive pressures of alternative supply and so on. We could talk about law enforcement. What do you do with unruly behavior? How do you discipline it? What incentives do you communicate by the institutions of law enforcement and punishment, et cetera? I've written a book about mass incarceration. I'm not saying lock up people and throw away the key. I might be more for saying if people break the law and you take them into custody, try to use that opportunity to facilitate their development in one way or another. But these are touchy matters. But I don't have a magic bullet here. I'm not going to pretend that I do.
So just following up on that, I mean, are you an optimist or a pessimist about what we can expect in the next few decades? Because it seems like, at least, there are fads and fashions that sort of can change quite rapidly, but it seems now that the kind of approach you're articulating is certainly not the most popular one among the loudest voices. Rather, it's the so-called anti-racism movement, emphasis on structural racism and so forth, seems to have the ear of many people today. So what do you anticipate as the prospects for improvement in the coming decades?
I'm a pessimist. I'd like to be wrong about this. I think my side, quote unquote, is losing the battle. I think it's a rearguard action that you see, let's say, in the K through 12 schools against so-called critical race theory. I mean, I think there are excesses on the right in terms of creating this demon called critical race theory, which people don't even know exactly what it is. And what their opposing agents have a sense that kids are being wrongly educated around racial issues. But And I do think that kids are being wrongly educated around racial issues, although it's not a grand conspiracy to, to turn kids against their own country or something. You can overplay. I would not, try to legislate what kids are taught in schools. I think that's a local affair, school committees and so forth and so on. But I'm a pessimist. I think I'm a pessimist not only about the questions of the condition of African-American society, but about the well-being of our country more broadly. I think the narrative of Black victimization has just taken on a life of its own. I heard a sitting member of Congress say, with respect to the migrants crossing the Mexican border into Texas who were congregating at the Del Rio and so forth, mostly Haitian. There was a big brouhaha, as you know, about the Border Patrol people and their horses and the reins of the horses and so on. The sitting member of Congress compared that situation to slavery. And I thought, my God, I thought this trope, this act, this performance, Black people are hated by America. America's institutions are fundamentally corrupt and they're fundamentally racist, has gotten to the point that the experience of African-American slavery 150 years ago is being appropriated on behalf of what? Open borders for Haitians to walk across. Maybe you want them to walk across. We could debate that, but it's not slavery. And yet, so comfortable are advocates in this kind of language and so intimidated are people. As soon as that kind of message got out, the Biden administration bent over backwards to prove that, well, no, we're not doing that. Well, And the point I'm trying to make here is not about the specific issue of border issues. It's that the rhetoric of victimization is so powerful and it's so seductive and it's become so legitimate that people just use it reflexively. And I don't know how to get out of that box. So I'm pessimistic about a movement. They call it Black Lives Matter. Black lives do matter. I agree. Now, if you've got 8,000 or 9,000 homicides a year in which Black people are being murdered, and you've got a handful of cases in which police officers behave inappropriately and extirpate Black life, that's bad. Those police officers should be confronted. But how could you possibly be fostering the integrity of Black life while having absolutely nothing to say to your community about the behavior of people in your community who are extirpating Black life? I mean, condemning them relentlessly. I mean, calling them what they actually are. I don't mean making excuses for them, and I don't mean looking the other way, and I don't mean waving it and saying there's nothing to see here. Now, okay, I am the conservative-oriented guy that I am, so, dismiss me if you will, but the situation, the intellectual and political failure reflected in the situation is what causes me to be relatively pessimistic about this. All of the organs of cultural power in the New York Times and the Washington Post and the MacArthur Foundation in Hollywood and so on, in the universities, all of the diversity, equity, and inclusion mobilization, it seems to me, ignores the points that I was trying to call our attention to in my remarks about the development narrative. And so for that reason, I don't know. I mean, I feel that I'm kind of, tilting at windmills a little bit, but I feel like I have to go ahead and say it, call it the way that I see it, and do the best I can.
So just following up on to combine some other questions here on the rhetorical point, could you briefly comment on how the language has changed? For example, the shift in the meaning of the term racism from, racial animus toward deliberate animus towards people of another racial group to, to so-called structural racism, the idea that if outcomes are different among groups, then that can be explained by racism. So the way we talk about, maybe another example would be the shift from an emphasis on equality, which typically referred to things you've mentioned already, like equality under the law, to the concept of equity, which again refers to how outcomes are distributed among members of different groups. How do you think that shift in terminology plays into these conversations?
Well, okay, I wouldn't I? This is me. I think it's transparent. I think what you have are disparities, and there's not any doubt that you have disparities. Now, equal opportunity plus disparities shifts the burden onto the parties who are lagging behind, and there becomes a question of why. Equity taking equity as the norm is basically defining an outcome as illegitimate unless it shows parity. So ipso facto, the existence of the disparity is an indictment of the system for the person who talks about equity. People don't want to face the possibility that and this is what I was getting at in my talk, and I know that it's difficult territory, and I could be wrong. I mean, I'm not saying that I'm infallible, but here's the provocation that I'm trying to bring to bear. People don't want to face the possibility that the system is absolutely okay, but it's that the people who are lagging behind who have got some issues. I'm not saying that they're intrinsically incapable. That was not my argument. But I mean, let me give an example of what I'm talking about, equity versus equality. There was a controversy at the Georgetown Law School not long ago, where a woman, Sandra Sellers, who was a member of the faculty, adjunct lecturer, was caught on an open mic reporting to her colleague that students lagging at the bottom of her class in terms of the grade performance were disproportionately Black students. This is at Georgetown Law Center. It's one of the premier law schools in the country. She says, unfortunately, ones at the bottom are disproportionately Black. It's like that way year after year. She didn't know she was being recorded. She was being recorded and it became public. And there was a huge firestorm of protest from Black students and faculty and then others at the law school. This woman was fired from her job for the racist comment that she made. Why is it a racist comment to accurately report that the poor performers systematically year in and year out in her classes were Black? Why is that racist? Only if you presume that their poor performance is the responsibility of the school and not of themselves. Now, in a way, I would say it is the responsibility of the school because the school is practicing affirmative action and it's admitting students of color with lower SAT score and grade profiles than others. This is an elite law school. So the school practices affirmative action. Kids come in with lower test scores and grades in their previous study, and they end up at the bottom of the class. Well, this is something a statistician would have told you was predictable. If the grades in college and the test scores on the law school aptitude test are correlated with post-admissions performance, and you have an identifiable population of students, Black students, who are admitted with lower criteria along those things that are correlated with post-admissions performance, then it's a statistical necessity that at least on the average, the post-admission performance in that population is going to be lower because the pre-admissions criteria that you use to select them were less favorable, and those criteria are known to be correlated with performance. Now, people can't even, I'm saying, the progressive faculty of Georgetown Law Center cannot even take responsibility for the inevitable consequence of their own preferential admissions policy. And rather than asking the question, how can we help our Black students who are struggling to perform better, they instead invent systemic racism within the institution as the bad guy to blame. How is this helping Black people? I mean, how is it fostering equality? It's a kind of patronization. It's a kind of patting on the head. It's patting them on the head. We don't expect you to be as good. And I'm sorry, maybe I've lost the thread of your question. I forgot what got me on this road.
Yeah. No, that's a great answer. Let me move.
I'm saying there's no equality except equality. Equity is a dodge, it's a fudge, and everybody knows it. Everybody knows. Anybody sitting in the classroom knows. Anybody who's hiring these people coming out knows what the objective differences in performance are. And you can call it equity if you want to, but if people are not performing, they're not performing. That's the only path to equality in my view.
Thank you. Let me address a question that's raised by one of my faculty colleagues. And it refers indirectly to another term that we hear a lot these days, and that's the concept of intersectionality. The idea that there are different characteristics of persons and groups, race, of course, but also gender, maybe sexual orientation or identity, nationality, disability status, and so forth, that intersect in particular ways. The specific question refers to a paper, which I don't know if you saw it, came out last year in the Quarterly Journal of Economics by Raj Chetty and several co-authors. I don't have the exact site handy, but the results show that conditional on family income, Black sons end up lower in the income distribution than white sons, but there is no difference in the income distribution between Black and white daughters, suggesting that maybe if social capital is the driver, that there's a gap between Black and white social capital for young men that maybe doesn't exist for young women. So I don't know if you remember that study specifically, but if you want to talk in general about how race might interact with gender and other characteristics to lead to some of the issues that people are talking about today.
Well, there's some there. I don't know if I have anything useful to say about it. I'm not familiar specifically with Chetty's finding, although I've heard it reported in other sources. There's something there when you look at the fact that I know it's almost 2 to 1 Black women to Black men who are matriculating at 4-year institutions of higher education. The SAT test takers, again, it's like 60% of the Black SAT test takers are women. The violence and criminal participation statistics are, the racial disparities are vast, but men are vastly overrepresented amongst those who are doing poorly along that dimension. And I could speculate here, but I'd only be speculating, okay? Now, single parent families, 2 out of 3 Black kids are raised by a mother alone. Is the consequence for child development more deleterious for boys than for girls in mother-headed families? Please don't get mad at me. I asked the question. I don't know the answer to it, but I've been invited to speculate about why we might have these gender differences amongst African Americans and social outcomes. And I don't see how you could avoid that hypothesis. That would have to be looked at more carefully by somebody with data who knows what they're doing. There could be as well institutional responses. It may be that to the extent that the people who talk about systemic racism have a point at all, that point weighs more heavily and adversely against African-American boys/men than girls. I don't know that to be the case, but that would be another thing to speculate about. Institutions can tolerate, in some sense, more readily take school discipline, where the suspension rates are very high for adolescent kids who are of color, but for boys more so than for girls, et cetera. Maybe it's easier to handle misbehaving girls in a way that you don't have to expel them from the institution. Again, forgive me for speculating, but you invite me to think about why we have these gender differences. So,
sure. Yeah, thank you. There's actually a follow-up question that asks whether mass incarceration might be relevant to this discussion as well, given that, of course, males of any race are incarcerated at much higher rates than females. could that lead to a gender imbalance in the marriage market that could also be driving some of the social dynamics we're discussing?
Yeah, that's a very old hypothesis in one form or another. William Julius Wilson, the sociologist, in his book, When Work Disappears, in his book, The Truly Disadvantaged, these books are 25 years old now, but he called it the marriageable pool hypothesis. And he had data on local marriage markets, cities around the country, where he looked at the marriageable men. And this had to do with not being in prison, being employed, et cetera. He would match up cohorts by age, and he would look at the number of women and the number of marriageable men, and he created an index. And that ratio of marriageable men to women was well below 1. It was sometimes even below 0.9. And so you get a lot of implications out of that. If there's a scarcity of partners on one side of the marriage market, you could talk about the family instability, about the extent to which men who in fact are marriageable are also, their bargaining position within households is different because the alternative options for their partners are not as rich. And so they can do things inside the partnership that they might not be able to get away with otherwise. And that could have some larger impact. So I credit Derek Neal, the economist at the University of Chicago, has been looking at the implications of removal of men from community into institutions of incarceration for economic outcomes in Black communities. So I think that's something to consider. I mean, in my 2008 book, which you were kind enough to mention, Race, Incarceration, and American Values, I talk about the collateral consequences of the institution of incarceration on the scale that it had grown to through the 90s and the first decade of the 21st century for communities. I mean, there's all kinds of, men don't stay in prison, they come out of prison having been influenced by the experiences that they had while they were in there. There's all kinds of stuff. Gangs becoming fragmented and in fact more lethal because they don't have the stewardship of the more senior gang members who have been themselves incarcerated and taken out of the picture and so on. So, I mean, we could spend a whole afternoon talking about that.
Right.
But it's such a huge factor. It would be surprising if you couldn't find that it was having knock-on effects.
So let me try to paraphrase a question from a student. I mean, I know you don't shy away from the tough questions, and this one is a little bit more tough. I'm going to paraphrase and then try to tie it into a broader issue that maybe you can address, because I think you've sort of touched on this already. But the question is from a student who identifies as an African-American student attending a predominantly white institution, which I assume is Baylor. And the question relates to the concern that the sorts of claims that you're making, both theoretical and descriptive, can be perceived as offensive or as demeaning, that both for Black students and maybe faculty who receive them, but also maybe they reinforce to white students and faculty this idea that, well, the Black students and faculty who are here are maybe different from you. Maybe they came here, they got special consideration to be at the university. Does this lead to, I mean, how does this affect sort of the social fabric across racial groups within an institution, like a university?
This is an important question. I don't want to shrink from it at all, because as I understand it, the motivation behind it has merit. If you talk like this, Loury, washing all this dirty linen in public, I mean, let's credit that the things that I'm saying are descriptively accurate. Now, if I'm getting it wrong, I'm getting it wrong. It's slander. Okay, it's a mischaracterization of the situation, and that should just simply be dismissed. No, you're actually wrong about the 70% born out of wedlock. You're actually wrong about the academic achievement gap. You're actually wrong about the homicide rate. But I don't think I'm wrong about those facts. I think those facts are accurate. You bring those facts to the table here in a mixed environment. Don't you know you're giving aid and comfort to racists and you're humiliating people of color. So I don't want to aid racists, and I don't want to humiliate anyone. That leaves me with a difficult problem. I can sugarcoat, look away, obfuscate, lie, or I can stay in touch with reality and put the truth as I see it in play for debate and let the chips fall where they may. Everybody's gonna have to make their own call about that. I can't be sure, say that I don't go down the road of talking about the hard stuff. Say I don't do it, say I sugarcoat. That the person who hears it, I don't go down that road and hope so they don't hear it, isn't already thinking whatever it is that they're thinking. I mean, you know, newspapers, I'm trying to search for the right example. Here's one from my home institution, Brown University. We're an urban college. We sit in the middle of Providence, Rhode Island, up on a hill. Providence is mixed socioeconomically, and there are poor people in Providence. Some of them are Black, some of them are brown, some of them are white. Crimes happen up here on our campus. Kids get mugged, their stuff gets stolen. It used to be that when the university would report about an event, it would be an announcement that would go around by email to everybody in the community. Burglary has occurred, robbery has occurred, assault has occurred. A description would be given of the assailant if one was available. So tall, male, female, dressed in this way, Hispanic looking, Black looking, etc. A few years ago, the university decided that the Department of Public Safety could no longer give that information. Now, they were intending, of course, in so doing, to stifle the stereotyping. They didn't want to have kids in the community, because most of the offenders actually were of color, thinking that anyone of color is a threat to them, because most of the people that the kids are seeing of color are other students, not potential assailants. So they were trying to manage the information in order to avoid a stereotype. So now, whenever there's an event, here's my theory. My theory is that the typical observer who picks up the newspaper and sees that there was an event assumes that the assailant was of color, because they're not provided with the information about it one way or the other, and because the background data suggests that more likely than not, the assailant was of color. What's better, actually saying what happened or letting people make their own assumptions about what happens? Okay, maybe that wasn't the best example, but the thing I'm trying to defend here is that we're not public relations agents in the university. We're not image management people. We're not in the advertising business. We're in the truth business. We're in the business of getting to the bottom of things. That is the only path to a durable management of these problems, is to stay in touch with the objective conditions. Now, would I say without qualification, you know, Black kids are just not doing very well or something like that? No, I would want to be careful about that. But if affirmative action is creating, as I gave the example of the Georgetown Law Center, I don't know anything about Baylor, but if it's creating differences after the fact in the actual performance of students by race, you can believe that people see that. Not speaking of it doesn't make it go away. So forgive me for being, I said I was not going to pull any punches. I said, you know, I wasn't going to mince any words. And maybe I'm taking too much of a kind of pleasure in being the town crier who comes out and says the emperor has no clothes, and I should be more circumspect about that. I don't know. But what I do know is that the facts will out in the end, no matter what. And, you know, we can spend our time trying to prettify something or we can look it deadly in the face and then try to deal with it the best we can.
Well, we certainly like our guests at the Free Enterprise Forum to speak from the heart and not to pull any punches. And you certainly delivered in terms of style as well as substance. So we're about out of time. And I want to thank you again, Glenn, for taking the time to speak with us tonight. I know it's been super stimulating and interesting and provocative talk, exactly the kind of thing that we had in mind. I'm going to take the liberty, I don't know if other people can, if you all can see in the chat window, I'm putting in links to Glenn Loury's official homepage at Brown, also his Twitter feed, and also his Substack if you want to follow him and keep up with his writings, both academic and popular. And I'm sure that if you think of a follow-up question later, you want to drop him an email. If he can, he would be happy to respond. So once again, please everybody join me in giving a virtual clap to Glenn Loury for speaking to us tonight. This session will be available on the Baugh Center for Entrepreneurship and Free Enterprise YouTube site on our YouTube channel. If you just Google search Baylor Free Enterprise, you can get to all of our stuff, or you can just do a YouTube search for Baylor Free Enterprise. You'll find in a couple of days a version of this talk and also all of the previous talks in this series and the other series that we sponsor. So once again, hope all of you have a great evening and the rest of the week. And thanks to Glenn Loury for speaking to us tonight. Bye-bye, everyone.
Good night, Peter.
Night, thank you.